So I want to welcome Occupy I, our friend Nathan Grant, coming to us live from New Jersey tonight. We happened to catch him in a stopping point so he could join us. I want to welcome all the viewers and the chatters. Thank you guys for being here tonight. Thank you for the other channels that are mirroring us. We have a really big show tonight. In all seriousness, we have Nate's going to be on and talk a little bit with us about his trip to New Zealand and the Christchurch area and set up that for us. And then at 8 o'clock, Sarah Miles will be joining us, and we'll start talking about the compare and contrast of the Christchurch situation with the Sandy hurricane situation. So lots of good information tonight, and we'll get right into it. So welcome, Nate. Why don't you go ahead and set up this video we're about to show here, and we'll let it roll.
Yeah, it's just a video from footage that I took while I was in Christchurch. I was in Christchurch from December 10th-ish to December 19th, so 9 days. So, I got something like 12 hours of footage the whole time I was there. Just sort of looking at the earthquake recovery effort in September of 2010, earthquake in the magnitude range of the 7 range hit to the west of Christchurch. There were no deaths caused by that earthquake, but in February 2011, 5 months after the initial earthquake, a huge aftershock hit right to the east of Christchurch. The epicenter was around an area known as Bexley. And so the video that we're going to watch, it's like 10 minutes long. The first half is downtown Christchurch, well, what we would call downtown Christchurch in New Zealand terms, the CBD, the Central Business District. It's kind of been relegated to a parking lot right now because that aftershock that hit in February 2011 killed 185 people and really did a number on downtown Christchurch. So the first part of the video sets that up, and the other half of the video is Bexley. It's where the epicenter of the quake was, and this little suburb was actually built on top of what used to be marshlands, and they only put what people have been telling me about, a meter of dirt between the marsh and the foundation that they used for all this housing that was built sometime in the 70s, and so the quake in February 2011, when it hit, it lasted about 20 seconds and just completely shook up sort of that layer of dirt that's there underneath the housing, and a bunch of liquefaction came up through, and these houses were sinking. And so basically the second half of the video is this abandoned neighborhood. The government has deemed it not fit for habitation. So everybody, whoever's left, and I think the number is hovering around 10% of people are still there, no power or water. Whoever's still there has to be out by April 2013. So yeah, it was just a really surreal experience being in this neighborhood. I spent half a day just in this neighborhood, taking video and pictures, and just I think I saw like 3 people the whole time I was there, and so yeah, I tried to fill the video up with like as many different pictures of houses. You just sort of get that feel, just whoa, it's pretty massive.
Okay, and I'm really grateful we have that, because one of the characterizations I've been trying to make is that Hurricane Sandy and the damage it caused on the northeast shore was is our Christchurch, and vice versa, and some of the same situations are happening. And when I was looking at this video earlier, I was going, that looks just like some of the stuff from Jersey Shore that Rousseau was showing us, when we did the walk and talk with him. So it's a pretty compelling illustration of how the problems we are facing are not unique to us. It is worldwide. It is a global issue, and all caused, ultimately by the same thing. So, without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and run that. And Nate, we'll stay connected if you want to mute your mic, and I'll do the same. And then we'll come back on when the video's over. So you guys hang on just a sec, and we'll let the video roll. Welcome back to Nate. Thank you for that incredibly powerful set of documentation. Watching the images fly by, I think, and you're watching OPN too, so you're seeing the chat. But people were struck by the desolation there. Do you have any sense of what those communities were like prior to the earthquake?
I did 2 interviews with former residents, a couple of people who were just completely in love with the community, in love with their homes, really heartbroken still, almost years after the fact. And one of these women, she broke down crying while she was talking to me about how she loved exactly where she was, where she lived. I mean, the area there's been, like I said, it's a red zone that they're going to be demolishing all of it. Those homes have been abandoned for quite some time at this point, for the most part. You see all the yards are overgrown, and that's actually. Both people that I interviewed who showed me their homes were just completely blown away by the quality of the plants that were popping up. One of them had strawberries popping up in her backyard, and started eating them. And she said they were like the sweet strawberries. It's interesting because this earthquake hits. And here's this neighborhood kind of being given back to nature. All the nutrients and everything mixed up in the liquefaction, and all these really high quality plants are coming up. out of sort of the ashes. But yeah, I saw a couple of questions here. Tarp asked where people, for the most part, most people are living with their families. There is public housing that sort of popped up to help with the housing crisis as a result of the earthquake. But they're not really doing anything to help people financially, in the sense that public housing is supposed to be cheaper, but it's at market rates. And Sarah's really going to be perfect to talk to about this kind of. She's on the ball when it comes to that kind of information about the finances.
Well, and not to cut you short, but that's a pretty good segue into wrapping this section up. We got Sarah waiting out there in New Zealand for us to connect and do the tech check. When you were doing the interviews, I want to finish with this question. Did you get a sense from the people that they were hopeful for their future, or were they, because this has been going on there for a couple of years. The first earthquakes hit in 2010, the last ones, assuming they've stopped, were like in February or so of 2012. So they've been through the ringer 2 years, plus all the fallout. So what was the sense of the people there? Kind of where were they emotionally?
A lot of the people I spoke to were, fighting the insurance companies themselves still, and at this point, weren't very hopeful, very cynical, very angry. I spoke to a city council member, and he told me, when the earthquake struck, it was kind of a pyramid structure of power. In order to get really important decisions made really quickly, you do need to give the power to just a few people and say, help, just cut through all the red tape and get through it. But as the recovery comes into effect, that pyramid of power is supposed to flip, and the power is supposed to be given back to the community, and that has not happened. And looking into other natural disasters, it looks like it's not happening on those fronts either. It sort of stays. The power kind of sort of stays in the hands of the few. Actually, the power when it comes to the recovery effort for Christchurch is actually based in Wellington, which is the country's capital, rather than being based right there in local Christchurch. So that locals can make the decisions about rebuilding the CBD and rebuilding the suburbs and where finances should be spread, resources spread. But they're not the ones making the decision. In fact, the city council is completely powerless. The head of the CERA, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Association. I'm trying to remember what it stands, but they had the recovery effort for the whole area, and losing my train of thought. Oh yeah, they asked the city council to draw plans for the business district. How do you want it to be fixed? How do you want it to look like? And they did draw out the plans, and CERA said, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do what we drew up. So.
And it all comes back to who has the power. And I think one of the themes of the night is disaster capitalism. A lot of
actually watched the shock doctrine for the first time while I was in New Zealand. So.
and there it is, right? I was speaking to somebody who's been working in the Rockaways 3 days a week this afternoon, and she said, it's like they were waiting just for all those people's, possessions and locations to be washed away so they could completely take that place over. So this is the world we live in. So I want to say thanks for being on tonight, and thank you so much for the vid. It was extremely compelling and powerful. Great job. Thank you for premiering it here with us, and
sure.
for all the work you're doing out in the field. This is our friend Occupy I, Nate Grant, citizen journalist. currently in New Jersey, and goodness only knows where he goes next. He's been to New Zealand, he's in New Jersey, and who knows what comes up, but we'll keep our eye on you. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Sure, no problem, Mark. Tell Sarah I said hi.
I will. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
I want to welcome to OPN tonight that Sarah Miles, who is in Christchurch, New Zealand. Sarah is a former investment banker, former investment bank lawyer, and if I'm correct, currently a psychotherapist. She is the author of Christchurch Fiasco, the Insurance Aftershock and its Implications for New Zealand and Beyond. We were able to connect with Sarah through Occupy I when he was in New Zealand, and it's turned out to be quite a substantive connection. Sarah has done this book, and I've read excerpts from it, and it's phenomenal. In our conversations, we have been discussing the similarities between the Christchurch evolution and what she sees as coming on as a result of post-Hurricane Sandy events in our Northeast. Sarah, welcome to OPN, and we're being broadcast on a couple of other channels. It's wonderful to have you. Thank you for coming to us from New Zealand.
Thanks, Mark. Isn't modern technology just amazing that here we are in the farthest end of the planet, able to communicate like this and share stories of post-disaster life in both the States and New Zealand. And I hope that in this exchange of information we can enlighten people a little bit about the experiences that we've had here in Christchurch, and perhaps prepare people a little bit in the US for what they're likely to face, particularly in terms of insurance, which is my focus, as you've so clearly stated.
And I just want to remind the chatters, we are running a live question pad, so I can pull questions off of it. I have it really tiny, so you know, if you can be patient with me, that'll be great. Also, we have a few links in the Etherpad, and clearly Arzena will be referencing those. Sarah, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit better introduction of yourself than I did. Some of the details of your background, your education and experience prior to the Canterbury Christchurch region earthquakes.
Yeah, sure. I am a later New Zealander, if you like. I was actually born in Wales, but my parents emigrated to New Zealand in 1972. And they've been here ever since, and so I consider myself a New Zealander. I was educated overseas, and as you rightly said, Mark, I have a background in law, and I am ashamed to say it these days, but I used to work in the investment banking world, and later on in my career I spent some time in the insurance industry. But for the last 9 years, I returned to New Zealand 9 years ago after a career in Europe, and I retrained as a psychotherapist, and I have worked extensively in that area for the last 9 years, and particularly after the Christchurch earthquakes. There were some special groups set up immediately after the earthquakes to do an assessment, a psychological assessment of the community. So I worked in some of these groups, and we dealt with particular individuals who were particularly stressed by the events that took place. And that gave me an opportunity to travel into parts of the city that I wouldn't normally have had the ability to get to, because there was so much damage and there were a lot of police cordons. So I really had a good look at the condition of the city and the psychological status of the people. So that gives me a good grounding upon, you know, to talk with some knowledge about just how the community was affected.
I do believe you bring a unique assortment of skills to the conversation, which is really valuable. It's not very often that people can see and speak accurately to the human side and for lack of a better word, the mechanics side, the finances, insurance, and all that. So we're grateful to have you. I'd like for you to maybe outline the demography of the region for us prior to the earthquakes. Like, give us a sense of the social structure, population, and kind of lay out what the region was like pre-earthquake, because I want to use that to contrast later.
Okay. New Zealand is definitely a first world country. We have a small population. We're 4 million in total. Christchurch itself is considered to be the second largest city in New Zealand, and it's often referred to as the gateway of the South Island. There are around 400,000 inhabitants, or at least there were prior to the earthquakes. We've lost quite a few people since then. So we represent 10% of the New Zealand population. Christchurch itself is built on a plain. It's surrounded by the sea on one side. There are some major rivers running through it, and we've got mountains on two other sides. So we sit in a big plain, and it's not noted as an earthquake area, although every 80 or so years there is a major earthquake in this particular region. New Zealand itself is very earthquake prone, and we're called the Shaking Isles. But the last earthquake we were experienced in Christchurch was around 1870, so it was quite a long time ago. So, for most of us, that's well beyond my generation, and so it really came as a massive shock to the population here, and we simply weren't prepared for the enormity of the events that have taken place. In the last 2.5 years, we have had 12,000 aftershocks and 6 or 7 major earthquakes. So it's really hard to get your head around, that number of earthquakes, and it does have, psychologically, has a profound impact, because you imagine that the earth is solid and isn't going to move, and then suddenly, your very foundation is shattered and shaken, and you're left wondering, is there anywhere safe? So it's had a profound impact on people.
Right, and the foundation shattered and shaken literally, not metaphorically. I mean, literally the ground people walked on.
That's right.
And it's interesting to hear you describe the historical progression, because let's say, for example, in our California, U.S. California, an earthquake would not be uncommon. Yet in New Zealand, they're known to happen, but just not in that region. So to set this up, it sounds reasonable that people were surprised by the frequency and severity. That seems reasonable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
People have been astonished at what has happened. And I mean, even, most New Zealanders thought, well, Christchurch would be one of the last places in the country to have an earthquake. And yet here we are, surrounded by devastation.
And one last question to try to get the picture pre-earthquakes. What was the regional and local economy like? Was it strong, vibrant? Was it depressed? Or, so give us a picture of that prior to the earthquakes.
Well, I suppose New Zealand, like every other nation around the world, has been struggling. We're also affected by the events globally. I wouldn't say that it was depressed, but it certainly hasn't been as buoyant as I've seen it in previous years. Post-earthquake, of course, job losses and whatnot have risen dramatically, and many people have moved out, and because of the loss of buildings, people have no place to go in terms of, their place of employment has been destroyed, which has had a flow-on effect. But no, we have a mixture of an agricultural economy and a service economy. And prior to the earthquakes, it wasn't super buoyant, but it wasn't depressed.
Right. Okay. So all in all, fairly reasonable and stable for most people. Okay.
Yes.
So that gives us a good picture of what it was like. Now let's touch a little bit on pre-earthquake government preparedness for disasters. Did you, as a citizen of the area, feel comfortable that your government would be able to respond to a disaster of what would seem to be reasonable proportions?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that I hadn't actually thought much about it prior to the disaster. I hadn't thought about whether or not my government would be able to cope with the events that transpired. Certainly when I, signed my insurance policy, I also didn't think much about it. All I knew was that I had a total replacement, house policy with a good content coverage, and I assumed that if anything went wrong, we'd be all right. We have in New Zealand, and I should just explain that quickly, we have what they call EQC, which is the Earthquake Commission, and as part of that commission there's a natural disaster fund, and that fund is set up to protect New Zealand citizens in exactly these kinds of circumstances. And the fund, what happens is that we've got an incredibly high private insurance coverage in this country. 93% of homeowners have insurance cover, so that is massive. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's so high is that private property insurance is compulsory in New Zealand. If you want a mortgage, you have to have private insurance. There's no way of getting around that. And also, because we are a seismic nation, this is one of the ways in which the country has attempted to protect itself in the event of a natural disaster. So within the Natural Disaster Fund, the way the government operates is that you pay a levy of 5 cents for every 100 New Zealand dollars insured, up to a maximum of 100,000 New Zealand dollars. And so in the event of a major disaster, the government, in the form of the Natural Disaster Fund, pays for the first $100,000 worth of damage, and then anything over and above that $100,000 worth of damage is the responsibility of the private insurer to pick up. So, you've got that base coverage, and then anything on top of that is private insurance.
Okay. And can I summarize that so I don't lose my track? So, there is a tax levied through your taxation system to which you pay in that provides you coverage on the first $100,000 New Zealand damage. Anything beyond that, the private insurer, your private insurer, would supposedly pick up. Is that accurate?
It's 90% accurate, except that what I would say is it's not a tax levy. It's a levy that is gathered as part of your private insurance premium.
Okay.
So the private insurer takes, that little portion of levy off, and that levy goes into the government natural disaster fund.
Okay. So I have that picture in my head. So
yeah.
So there is substantive coverage for all property owners. Now let's talk about the earthquakes. If you can take us back to 2010, on day, we'll say day 0, the sun came up, everything was wonderful, and then things started shaking. So this is not to trivialize. I'm just trying to couch it in terms, but I want to have you walk us through the progression of the first earthquakes. how the government responded, and how that all started to unfold over time.
Okay. The sun never came up on the September 4th. The earthquake took place at 4:30 a.m. in the morning, so most of us were in bed, and that's probably just as well, because it was a 7.1 earthquake on the Richter scale, and had that happened while people had been wandering around town or in work, the numbers of deaths that occurred would have been much higher. But as it was, because everybody was at home, tucked safely in their wooden homes, and all that happened was lots and lots of property damage and land damage, but no deaths. So at 4:30 a.m. On that morning, I woke up actually standing on my feet, and my husband was thrown out of bed, and he hit his head on the doorway and broke his nose and had a black eye. And I can hardly put into words really what happened, but the floor, the ground, rose up and down a meter, just thumping up and down. The noise was colossal. The building strained and quaked under all of the movement. And yeah, it was just an undescribable moment. But I knew the moment it all began what was happening. There was no doubt in my mind as to what was going on. I suppose we have quite a strong education system in terms of education for earthquakes. You know, children learn from very young age what to do when you have an earthquake, what an earthquake feels like and does, and so in that respect I was pretty prepared. Our house suffered really major damage. We live in the country. We were just a few kilometres from the epicenter, 6 kilometres from the epicenter. We're a rural property, and so we have a large header tank, a water tank in our ceiling, and that came loose, and 500 litres of water poured from the header tank all through the house, and it was still pitch black, so you've got the sound of running water everywhere. You know, you've got electricity around, so your first thought is to turn off the electricity. And just total chaos in the house, you know, books everywhere, china everywhere, food everywhere, just absolute chaos. And it was clear from, you know, the moment we were aware of what was happening that there was no way we were going to be able to continue to live in that house. So 2.5 years later, we still don't live in our house, and we still haven't resolved our insurance claim. And you know, but that's a long story. And I must say that the book that I wrote is not about my personal story. It's about, you know, insurance and reinsurance and policyholder protection. It's not about the morning of September 4th earthquake. So what happened after then? Well, we sat in the car for a while after the event itself, and we watched the house shudder some more, because we had something like 170 earthquakes within the next 4 hours, just colossal. So there was still a lot of movement, and the car felt like a safe place to be. So we just sat and bumped around and watched the land and the earth move. And then, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask if your residence was located in an urban area or suburban, or a little bit more outskirts of town, or kind of place it geographically for us.
Yeah. We live on a rural property, 10 acres, 13 kilometres from the centre of the city.
Okay.
So we're well out of the urban area. And I must say I'm really thankful for that, because when things go wrong in a major way in a city, the devastation and the destruction is so great, and it takes so long to tidy it up, that if you're living in the middle of it, you know, you're constantly reminded of the challenges ahead and the mess that's left behind out here in the country. When I look out the window or around, you know, the trees are still there, the grass still grows, and there's a bit more of a sense of normality. Yeah.
Okay. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go right ahead.
No, I was just thinking about, you know, your question in terms of the government and their role immediately post-earthquake. I think it would be fair to say that after the first earthquake, it wasn't declared a national emergency. It was considered a local event. And so life pretty much went on as per usual, and the Christchurch City Council, which is the local government body here, had the responsibility for doing what is required after a major event like that. It wasn't until the February 22nd event, which was the next seriously major earthquake that killed 185 people, that it was declared to be a state emergency, or a national emergency, and then that caused a whole pile of other triggers, and suddenly the central government was much more heavily involved.
So
yeah.
I want to compare it to kind of how I understand the situation in the United States was. So the initial event was a local event, which would be comparable to like a city/state event in the United States. The second event created enough damage and had enough destruction where it was declared a national emergency, which engaged your federal government operations.
That's right.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. I hope I'm not being too tedious. I just want to make sure we have a good picture. How did the mainstream media in your area respond to this as it unfolded?
The mainstream media, and particularly the Christchurch Press, which is the local newspaper, has done a tremendous job of covering the stories in Christchurch, and still, 2.5 years later, the papers are full of the difficulties and the issues that have arisen as a result of this event. However, and I use that word, broadly, immediately after the earthquakes, countrywide, there was a lot of information about the earthquakes and about the damage and the need to contribute funds to help with the rebuild, and there was an incredible outpouring of good wishes and people offering help, and that was tremendous. But as time has gone on, of course, the media focus has remained solely local interest, and the rest of the country pretty much has no clue about what's actually taking place here, and the degree of difficulties that New Zealanders are having resolving their insurance claims, for instance, or the incredible difficulties they have with the central government, and the feelings that the central government is no longer listening to the people. There's a real sense that there's been a breakdown of democracy. And
that sounds very familiar. And our Hurricane Sandy is only not even 3 months into it, and we're already experiencing that.
Yeah. It took Christchurch people 4 months before they started feeling as though things were out of step. The central government had high visibility immediately after the initial events, but now you never hear from the Prime Minister, or we have a senior government minister who has responsibility for, or is in charge of the rebuild of Christchurch, but his focus is purely on the central city, and in terms of residential recovery, he doesn't seem to have any interest or any particular personal emphasis in that area. So people have really been left to themselves to struggle with these massive problems on their own.
And what, you touched on this earlier. You had a population of roughly 400,000. What percentage of the population has been displaced due to these events?
That's very difficult for me to give you an exact figure, but what I can say is that there were 540,000 claims. We have a population of 400,000 at that time, and yet there were 540,000 claims. That will have been multiple claims for different earthquakes and business claims as well. But 75,000 new houses have to be rebuilt.
So 75,000 that we know about and that are documented.
Yes.
Which is a significant, I'm doing the math in my head pretty quick, like 20% of the population displaced. So I think, why don't you continue your story and lead us in to what experiences you had that prompted you to write the book, and then follow that with some highlights of specific problem areas that you identify in the book.
Okay. In terms of the book, the Christchurch Fiasco, what I'd like to say again is that it's not my personal story. It was very important for me to document what has taken place here, and in light of the fact that there are literally thousands of people who have their own stories, it didn't seem to be very useful for me to just write about my personal case. That was not the intention of the book. The reason I wrote the book was because it quickly became apparent that New Zealand, and not only New Zealand but other citizens in other countries around the world, have no idea about how poorly protected they are as citizens in the event of a disaster. We sign insurance policies, and then a little bit further down the line, when these events take place, we quickly discover that we do not have the protection we think we have. The catastrophe provisions that we have in this country did not protect us, and because we live in a seismic country, I really wanted to give the rest of New Zealand a clear picture of what has taken place here, particularly in light of the fact that the media has been so reticent around telling the story as it really is, and letting the rest of the country know what's happening here. 2.5 years post-disaster, and still thousands and thousands of displaced people with no resolution in sight, and no apparent government support, and many people feeling that the government, it's no longer government for the people or by the people. People feeling as though they're muzzled, that there's a top-down model and not a bottom-up model, and people are wanting to rebuild their city, and yet they're having very little say as to how that's going to be done. So there's a real sense that there's a lack of participatory decision-making, and that really there's far too much power in the hands of only a few. Slow me down, Mark, if I'm rambling.
This is great. You're focused.
Okay. And I think one of the other major issues that we're seeing here, and one of the things that I found most shocking about this whole event, is that we're seeing government supporting corporate policy. It's no longer government for the people, but the government has not stepped in anywhere along the line and said, okay, the insurance industry, you have said that this is what you provide, why are you not providing it? So there's just a total lack of policyholder protection, and unlike the US, I think you're a little bit more organized in the US, in the sense that I know that post-disaster, often the US government instigates mediation service, for instance. If there are many thousands of policyholders who need to resolve insurance claims, then they set up a mediation service whereby, those claims can be heard much more quickly and some resolution come to. And the other thing that you have in the US that we don't have here are exemplary damages, punitive damages. So that if a judge or a court says, well, this insurer has clearly behaved really badly, we will punish them via a really heavy financial penalty. We don't have that here either. So all around us we have massive insurance issues. We have people losing incredible amounts of equity in their homes. The middle class is slowly being eroded away, and our government isn't doing anything to stop it happening. And I was just so incensed by what is happening in this country. We always think of New Zealand as clean, green, friendly, easygoing, and yet what we're finding is the same thing that we're finding in other countries around the world. So I felt that, we had to create another model to protect our citizens. So in the Christchurch Fiasco, I provide another model for citizen insurance.
So you're in the book, you lay out an academic model for people to consider.
Yes.
And in your country, what does it take to implement something like that? Is that a long, involved or process, or how much response is it getting?
I think it very much depends on the government of the day, and at the moment we have a very right-wing national government, and whose philosophy is leave it to the market. You might even argue that they have very little, they're showing very little care about their population, their affected population here in Christchurch. So I think it would be fair to say that a government like that will not pick up the model that I'm suggesting. The only way that it will be picked up is by sheer force of citizen insistence, or another political party who sees merit in a model that excludes the private insurance industry.
And so, what is the insurance industry's positions? Are they, clearly they're deliberately neglecting and stonewalling, but what is their particular agenda?
Profit is their particular agenda. And that's really the problem with the private insurance industry post-disaster. There's a massive ideological misfit between eye on profit and shareholders and the recovery of a population post-disaster. You cannot tackle the rebuild of a city and people's lives with profit as your main focus. The two just simply do not fit together. In terms of the insurance industry, they seem to be keeping their heads to the ground, and we don't hear from them very often, other than statements around the fact that they're not delaying and they're not stonewalling, and this is one of the biggest events in the world, and just the usual excuses that you would expect of an insurer. So it's very, very disappointing.
Highlighting some of the specific problem areas, and we were talking about the insurance, their goal is leveraging the disaster for profit. So we have sort of simultaneous problems going on, because the people, you yourself and the rest of the population there, are battling the rebuilding. You're bringing your life back in order, repairing, but at the same time you're having this problem with the insurance companies. What is the general population doing to address the insurance issue? Is there a rising up of the people? Are they too preoccupied by trying to address the damage? I mean, this has been going on for 2.5 years. Clearly, it's a substantive issue. So what is the general population able to do, and what are they doing?
Yeah, well, you know, a general population is made up of all kinds of people, and there are those who have just gone to ground. There are those who are seriously psychologically affected by all of this, and there are many who are not coping. There's been a big rise in the number of marriage breakdowns. You know, there's been a lot more domestic violence, so it's had a very negative effect in that respect. And then there are others who stick the stick in the ground and they say, you know, you're not going to do this to me, we're going to fight. And we're seeing more and more people heading to the courts. Last count, bearing in mind that, you know, New Zealand is not a very wealthy country particularly, and the cost of justice in this country has become astronomical. It costs about 70,000 New Zealand dollars to take a claim to the High Court, and it has to be in the High Court because property damage tends to be above 200,000, and so the District Court has a limit of 200,000. The average income in New Zealand is around 50,000, 56,000. So, you know, that's an annual income. So 70,000 is a huge sum of money for most people, and so justice simply isn't available for the majority of people. So for those who can't afford it, they wait to see what the outcome is of some of the test cases that go through the courts. But we haven't really begun to see an onslaught of those cases. It's coming, but it's been pretty slow. And, you know, the other thing about New Zealanders is that they tend to be very, they believe that that everyone's working for the best and everyone's doing their best and that, you know, it'll all come out in the wash. But people are quickly discovering that this is a massive problem and that their lives are being encroached upon by a failing private insurance industry.
And that has to be doubly discouraging, because if you have your typical viewpoint is that people are generally good, and then you're running into all this corruption, mismanagement, and profiteering off people suffering, that has to have a very intense psychological effect. How do you get up and face that every day?
I think that's a really good point, Mark, and I think that the consequences of what you're talking about are yet to be seen, and I think what we will see is that the moment people settle their insurance claims, they will leave this area because it leaves such a nasty taste in your mouth that the only way that you can, you know, cleanse your palate is to go and settle somewhere else and hopefully forget about it for a while. So I think we're going to see massive population flight.
Which is, you know, I keep making the reference here in the chat as we're going on. You're 2.5 years into this. Yes. Sandy is not even 3 months. We haven't begun to, but we can see all the planets lining up in the same direction. So how do we, as a people, as a population, how do New Zealanders, how do Americans as a country respond to that? These big monolithic entities, how do we address them?
What I wanted to say to you is that, you know, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. It really is. It's a marathon. And that means that you have to take a completely different psychological toolkit with you. The first thing I would say is that it is critical that people work together. You know, these are massive organizations, they have their own agendas, and they try to sort of pick people off one by one. And the way to combat this kind of mentality is simply to work together. You know, with Facebook and online chat rooms, you can share information, you can talk about the companies you're dealing with, you can talk about the kinds of things they're telling each of you, you can talk about policy wording and what your loss adjuster said in such and such a circumstance, so that people have a really clear understanding of what they're up against. And the more you talk, the more information and the more tools you have to combat what you're up against. So I think creating support groups early on is absolutely critical. Yeah.
And, you know, we were referencing that as, you know, banding together and practicing mutual aid for a long time. One of the conversations we've had, and I'm interested in how the Christchurch area has addressed this, that this is a long haul. We're on the front end of an extremely long battle. And life goes on, right? I mean, people, you still have all the normal life stuff. So how is your community responding to that? Do you see mutual aid and cooperation coming together more frequently and in larger forms, or is still trying to work that out?
What I see is lots and lots of little satellite groups, you know, groups of friends who meet together every other day to do some exercise together and also share stories about their claim and how it's going. There are all sorts of people who've set up blogs, or you know, there are other larger groups called We Can and Rebuild Christchurch, and they all do their little bit in terms of providing information and information sharing activities. So it's really been a groundswell of community activity, and that is the only way you can survive, really, is to stick together and pull through together.
And do you have, you know, in that process, are you developing, is your community developing alternative media? Like, I would characterize yourself as an alternative media outlet to get this information out to the world and to a broader audience to help. Do you see more and more people doing that?
I think from the response that I've had from the book, the impression I get is that there's quite a lot of fear in New Zealand around speaking out, and I think that's very unfortunate. I would say that I would be one of the first proponents for change and for community awareness in terms of just how widespread the problems are and the degree of the problems and the government involvement in the problems.
Yep. We're putting your WordPress site up in the chat, and I would encourage all the people that are viewers to take some time to read through that, also some of the book excerpts, and to forward that to all our friends involved in Sandy Aid, because it's a really good snapshot of what I think might be laying ahead for us. So I'm grateful that you have done the work. I want to come back to your... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just add there, Mark, that if there's anybody out there, you know, involved in the Sandy situation who wants to write something for my blog, I take guest blogs and guest posts, and if anybody wants to write anything, I'd be more than happy to publish it. So, you know, this is a global fight. It's not just, you know, New Zealand, which is a long way away from the States, and we're seeing the same problems arise in Italy post-earthquake, in the US post-hurricanes. You know, these are problems that are rising more and more frequently, and with this concern about climate change or the increasing number of natural disasters, we need to be having global discussions. So I really want to encourage people to come on to the blog and have a global discussion.
Yeah, we are fortunate to have one of the people that we've interviewed off of the Jersey Shore is here watching tonight, and they plan to contact you with some information. We have some parts of our region have gotten more exposure than others,
Yeah.
Much the same situation as yours. You know, the very local media focuses on it because it is their people, but the national media pretty much has ignored it. You know, because it's the story of the day, right? Meanwhile, the people affected live it every day. So
That's right.
I think hopefully we can make some connections and some relationships there. So I want to come back to kind of bring this full circle.
Yeah.
You have been involved with you and your family struggle with the insurance companies now for 2.5 years, and you have a skill set that probably allows you better ability to address it than the average person.
And you're sitting there thinking, how is it that in 2.5 years you haven't been managed to solve your claim? Well, I scratch my head myself. But, you know, we're really up against titans of deny, delay, defend, masters of, you know, the worst kind of corporate behavior. And I really, when I look around the city and I see people struggling, I'm even more determined to let the rest of the world know what's going on here and to warn people that, you know, private insurance is simply not what it's cracked up to be, and that we have to find other ways of protecting our citizens, national, public ways of protecting citizens.
And I'm encouraged, you know, to get deeper into your book and read it. And do you want to describe your model? Do you think that would be productive for you to just lay out the highlights of the model you propose?
Yeah, sure. At the moment, you know, I talked briefly about the Earthquake Commission and the fact that we have this natural disaster fund. What I would propose is that we have a completely public system. So we take something like the Natural Disaster Fund and we still have property premiums. There would be 100% insurance coverage. Everybody who owned property would have to be insured. But that insurance would be public insurance. So your premium would go straight into a government-run Crown entity, which would be run like a private firm, but without the emphasis on profit. All premiums would go straight into that fund. I'm not talking about taxes or, you know, no additional taxing. All the premiums would go into the fund. And in a country like New Zealand, where you have 4 million people, that fund would immediately jump to around 4.1 billion New Zealand dollars. So if you're putting 4.1 billion New Zealand dollars into a fund on an annual basis, very quickly that fund bloats to enormous proportions, which means that you no longer have a massive requirement for reinsurance funding. And it also means that in times of non-disaster, that fund can be used, or a portion of that fund can be used for the benefit of various projects within the country itself. And in that way, you have people who know how to run insurance and know how to perform loss adjusting duties, who are based throughout the country, so that in the time of disaster you can quickly round up all the people you need to address insurance related issues when they arise. And I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, people say, oh, well, you know, a government couldn't possibly fund private insurance, but that's simply not true. I mean, you know, we've got umpteen dozen private insurers in this country, all running businesses and all making profit. What makes people think that a government couldn't do exactly the same, if not better? They'd certainly have lower operating costs than the private insurers.
You know, it occurs to me, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but are you considering running for office?
No, I don't have any political what's the word, ambitions whatsoever.
Yeah.
I'm definitely a back office type.
You're a wonderful advocate for your people and your cause, I have to say, and this has been incredibly informative. What observations or advice do you have for our people affected by the Sandy hurricanes going forward? I think you touched on that about organizing in support groups and being into it for the long haul. Do you have any other encouragement or advice for them, maybe practical or a call to action for all of us?
Well, I mean, I'm still in the same position myself, and what I would say is that some days life's okay and other days life's not. And some days you think, oh yeah, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and other days you feel like you've only just stepped into the tunnel. And so it's a real seesaw and roller coaster of emotions, and it's only over when it's over. And the only way that I think that you can keep your spirits up is to remind yourself that one day things will get back to normal, and you'll be able to step back on that life path that you were on prior to this event, and it will become a distant memory. But it's a life-changing experience, I think. I think it gives you a different level of understanding and compassion for all of those times that we've sat and listened to the news and heard about flooding in Bangladesh or, massive mudslides in Thailand. Now, we have an understanding, really a deep understanding of what that means. So, as a closing comment, I'd just like to remind people that, it is a marathon and it isn't a sprint. Prepare for a long-term battle. Don't be hard on yourself. It's not a country-specific problem. It's a global problem, and we need to be having global discussions about these issues. And be an advocate for a national system of protection.
Yep. Well, thank you for all that, and I'm struck by the thought that, as you said at the very beginning of the show, you're 3/4 of a world away from us, but how we are all more alike, and our life situations are much more similar than we might imagine, because you and your community are going through exactly the same thing as the Jersey Shore, Long Island, Staten Island, the Rockaways, on and on, and that we are all in this together.
We are.
And I want to thank you for being on with us tonight. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to make? I mean, I kind of dominated the conversation.
No. What I'd like to say is, love to you all, and good luck to you all. And, these are hard times, but we can get through it.
Yep. Well, thank you for leaving us on an optimistic note. And for all your work, you are an excellent representative of your community and an outstanding and inspiring advocate. And we really appreciate your work and your time and your energy. So thank you for joining us tonight. And I'm reading off the chat. People are expressing their appreciation and their gratitude. A lot of the Sandy people are weighing in. I think you might be getting some emails and stuff from those folks. And so, if nothing else, maybe we build a few more bridges tonight, and we can come together and attack that big monolithic industry from two sides of the world simultaneously.
Right, that's what we need to do. So, and I'd love to hear from people. So, drop me a line, and let's get that global conversation happening.
Okay, well, thank you very much for contributing to it. This has been Sarah Miles coming to us live from New Zealand. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much. It was an absolute delight, and we hope to talk to you again.
Absolutely, Mark. Thank you, too. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Have a good day.
You too. Okay.